we're live with myself and Jeff, who sounds like he's adding some numbers up on a big calculator. Over to Jeff.
That was just the keyboard of this computer, because I have this, once again, the luxury of having both the iPad and the desktop here, so I can actually see what's going on the Hangout at the same time as I'm looking at this stuff to read. But anyway, we're doing Homicide, Life on the Street, Season 5, Episode 14, which is called DIENER, a title that I was unfamiliar with before, looking it up for this episode originally. Is a morgue worker, basically. Yeah. Not the medical examiner, but someone who, does the other dirty work when it comes to the bodies. It was originally aired January 31st, 1997, and was written by Christopher Kyle, Tom Fontana, and Julie Martin, and directed by Kyle Secor, who plays Bayless. Actually had a little bit more lines in this episode than Clark Johnson typically has had in the episode. Episodes that he's directed, he's pretty much been missing from the episode for the most part, and Bayless actually had quite a few lines in this one, so even directing, he found time to do that. Anyway, here is what David B226 Morris on TV.com has to say. Homicide began 4 years ago. Frank Pimbleton was the lone wolf on the squad, preferring to work alone. This aspect of his personality was curved when Bayless began to work with him in the pilot. Now that Tim has decided that he doesn't want to be partners with him anymore, Frank is back to his old ways. When Meldrick Lewis shows up to back him up in the opening of DIENER, he is pissed off. Part of this is no doubt based on the last case they partnered on Disorder, which we flash back to a couple times during this show. But part of this is no doubt due to his single-minded, workaholic nature that was present even when he worked with Bayless. Because of that, Frank tells his wife that for the first time since his stroke, he feels like his old self again. In one sense, this is true. Frank is no longer stumbling over words or has a faulty memory. Unfortunately for Frank, his return to normality also means that part of his nature has resurfaced at home. Mary, who has been a pillar of strength for her husband through his long recovery and beyond, is finally reaching the limits of her patience. She now asks to see a marriage counselor, but Frank blindly ignores her complaints. He gets a certain amount of support from Meldrick on this, though considering his marital difficulties, Frank would perhaps do well to talk to anybody else. But the problems are so visible that Mary comes down to work to talk with Tim. Being a detective is Frank's life, but she doesn't know if being the wife of a detective is what she wants to be anymore. When Tim subsequently holds out an olive branch to Frank, however, Pimbleton rejects it. This old blindness and arrogance will end up costing Frank. Okay, the psychology of Frank is always interesting, but it is noticeable because this episode doesn't have a great deal more to offer. The case that is the center of DIENER, the murder of a socialite, is a relatively limp one, though it does show a certain amount of sparks to see Frank and Meldrick crossing swords again on who to suspect. Interestingly, this situation is somewhat reversed from Law and Disorder, where Frank suspected someone from an urban setting for a murder, while Meldrick suspected someone from a more upscale setting. This time, Lewis suspects the lower stratum suspect, while Frank suspects the nearest and dearest, the socialite's brother. This time comes not from the police work, but from a procedural problem when the victim's diamond ring disappears from the body. This item could implicate the killer or provide him with a defense. However, it turns out that the ring was stolen by someone in the AME's office. While no doubt things like this happen occasionally on the job, one can't escape the feeling that this time it happened to once again bring Dr. Cox into the story. As we find out, the thief turns out to be someone that she has recently hired, the DIENER from the episode's title. The DIENER is an individual who starts and finishes an autopsy procedure. In one sense, this is real homicide. The thief is exactly who we suspect it is. However, it feels more like an effort to have Juliana feel the same sense of betrayal that is often felt by the other detectives on the show, something similar to Kellerman's recent travails with the FBI. The whole feeling is one of forcedness that doesn't work dramatically. Speaking of Kellerman, we only briefly see the detective when he tells Meldrick that he's going to see a therapist in regard to his recent dark night of the soul. He is trying to get past these impulses and appears to succeed, at least for the moment. Then again, Mike will have a whole new set of problems to deal with soon enough. Overall, this episode is a disappointment as a directorial debut for Secor, though none of the problems with the episode are his fault. The good moments from the episode occur mainly between Brower and Clark Johnson, along with a fine job by Amy Brabson as Mary. The case that is the center of the show seems less important than it does most of the time, and while this isn't necessarily a handicap. This time it doesn't lead to great fireworks of any kind. Even the musical montages seem second class.
Yeah.
Ultimately, Diener isn't a bad episode, it's just not a very good one. With a mediocre mystery and somewhat forced character relevance, the episode is doubly hampered. The one thing that does linger is the problem Frank is having domestically, and which he is right now ignoring. But like on all homicides, the problems don't go away after the next case. My score, 5.9. That's what he says. Ben, what do you say?
I say that when I was watching this episode, I was easily distracted. When I saw Teddy play Christopher Kyle, I thought, is that the namesake of the SEAL that died? Christopher Kyle? There was a SEAL or sniper guy that died. Anyway, I'll just throw that out there. People can check that out. Christopher Kyle, Chris Kyle. The plot was uninteresting to me. I was much more into, because we're looking at this through the lens of typology, folks. But I was more interested in thinking about Lewis as an introvert and Frank as an extrovert, and that is, and if somebody was doing a drive-by typing, people would say that Lewis is the extrovert and Frank is the extrovert. But if they were to use, but we'll get more onto that later on.
Yeah, because I am interested to hear what your thoughts about that. It sounded like an interesting thing.
Yeah, we'll go on to that because you've got good thoughts on introversion, extroversion as well, because you've made that journey yourself.
Yeah,
between...
so I'm used to talking about that subject.
And also, yeah, just one plot point. Right at the start, they said something about, we see photographs being taken of the hands. It's within the first few seconds. And the hands are really close. You can see all the rings and stuff. Yet they make out, and you can see like flash bulbs going off or whatever. And they said, oh, they looked at Brody's tapes. What about looking at the photographs? So that's just a small thing. Oh, yes. Before we talk about the typology, I'll bring up the issue of police pay. Well, Diener's not an actual police officer, but what I've actually learned from Peter Schiff, from a guest, is that this is how it works. And I actually learned this from a television series that Jeff didn't watch because he didn't like the parents. That being Everybody Loves Raymond, apart from Jeff. And that being that Robert retired after 20 years. Because being a police officer is such a dangerous job, they retire after 20 years, apparently. Now, part of that is, and this will interest people before we then move on to the typology aspect, and that is their pension is calculated upon how much they were paid in their final year. So what tends to happen is they tend to have an agreement amongst themselves that whenever anyone is coming up towards retirement, they all give the overtime to that person. So that person gets as much overtime as possible so that their final year salary is as high as it can be, and then that makes their pension as high as it can be. And the reason why this whole subject came up is that a lot of jurisdictions are actually paying more on police that have retired than active duty cops. And so that's one thing, a little nugget there. But I do remember Diener saying, or actually it was, plus he gives himself up rather easily, does Diener, if that's his name. I don't know.
No, that's the job.
Right, okay.
His name is actually the same as me. It's Jeff.
Right. I try to pretend that's because of lack of interest in the story, but it's more to do with me not being very attentive. Juliana really forced it out of him. Frank would have been clapping his hands at how brilliant their interrogation tactics were. When she mentioned only 20,000 a year, and I remember a routine actually from 1996 where Chris Rock, and this is relevant, does a routine about if you're paying 30,000, you're getting paid only 30,000 a year, and your wife wants half your money, she's got to die. And actually, Chris Rock thought that would be the controversial routine in that 1996 act, not N-worders versus black people, but he thought the routine about the O.J. Simpson stuff and killing your wife. So he's on 20,000, not even 30,000. So I'll mention that. So that's that boring plot out of the way. So yeah, let's talk about the characters of. So what are your thoughts, Jeff, on? Or did you want me to say a bit more on the introversion extroversion thing?
Well, I mean, do you want to move through the photos first?
Well, let's see how many photos there are, because what happened was there was a little bit of a balls up, because it wouldn't copy to my stick to put it on the laptop where I could take VLC snaps. So consequently, I only took 4 photos with my phone. Is why. So you got this, and I remember looking at that. She's an attractive woman of a certain age, and then I thought, now she's even more of a certain age. No, it's 20 years later, and and look at G with his bigger afro there.
All right. Well, since you said you wanted to talk about, you wanted to do some comparing and contrasting with Lewis and Pemberton, then why don't we leave it on that photo to talk about that?
Yep.
So, go ahead.
Yep. So yeah, just in functional terms, because you're more articulate on this subject than me, but what I was thinking about was, and things that you have mentioned, that, and also there's a couple of non-type factors involved here. From a function point of view, I would say that Lewis's top function is introverted feeling, and socionics calls that ethics of relations. And the idea is that these people are good at judging psychological distance between people and then what is appropriate. So that's one aspect of it. And socionics thinks and MBTI will think all the SFs are relatively social. But I think a bigger thing is shown in like the first minute or two.
I guess I would say a more accurate thing than social would be to say people-oriented.
Yes, okay, yes. I'll go along with that. And in fact, no, don't just go along with that. I'll be corrected by that. Lewis, oh gosh, what was I going to say? Yes, there's also some extra stuff going on here where in the first minute or two, you see Frank correcting, in his opinion, being a bit snippy with Lewis just because he said the word guess.
Oh, yeah.
And then he comes back.
Extrapolate and...
Yeah. And then and Juliana says the same thing. And I think part of this is it's not just the natural introversion extroversion thing. It's the non-type factor thing of Frank is very well educated. We had this thing in previous episodes that he was taught by the Jesuits. He knows Latin and Greek. Mm-hmm. To be fair, he has a little bit of a superiority complex. If you see the way Lewis interacts with people, he talks more in Ebonics. He is from the area. He talks about being poor. So, and the types of people that he encounters, especially black people, are going to be more the kind of people that are like those he met in his background. And I suppose the kind of people that Frank is meeting are not as similar to him as they are to Lewis. So So there's a non-type fact, and we have seen. So, for instance, we have seen Frank in certain upscale settings, whereas with his wife in like classy restaurants and things. So, do you think that's also part of it, Jeff? There's sort of like the class aspect, society aspect, that they move in different circles. That Frank's a little bit more elite and superior.
Like friction between them?
No, I was just thinking, like generally in terms of what I mean. It's like in the first episode, it's like the ISTP guy, the one played by a Baldwin, says that, oh, high and mighty Frank, he thinks he's better than all of us.
Yeah, and that actually was one of the aspects of that was covered in David Simon's book about Harry Edgerton, the guy that Pendleton was based on. That they did. There was a little bit of animosity of the rest of the squad towards him because he had come into the homicide unit, and this was never actually covered on the TV show, but that the first thing he had been doing was he was actually partnering with a federal detective on like federal drug enforcement cases.
Right.
He was doing that and spent almost all his time on that. He didn't respond to most of the regular calls that the squad was getting. So the rest of the squad sort of developed a little bit of resentment for, oh, this guy, you know, he thinks he's big time. He doesn't handle like regular cases. He always does just stuff. And so that was sort of what started it, and sort of gave him the reputation of people thinking, oh, he's arrogant. He's got this, you know, he thinks he's better than us kind of attitude.
I'm not even sure that's legal.
And even the line in the first episode where Felton says he thinks he's better than us because he listens to Emmylou Harris, that was a direct thing out of the book that said about him that he was, you know, that the black cops that were present in the squad at the time didn't relate to him because he didn't fit in with what they were into, and he had this not only a New York state of mind, but like you said, a little bit more like upper class kind of thing, and like eclectic music taste. He wasn't into like rap and R&B and stuff as much as the others, so they kind of didn't see him as one of them.
Also, there's a little bit of there's something one where it got really hot, and apart from Bayliss being attracted to an attractive woman that never turns up again, besides that was Giardello wants Frank to take that tie off.
Yeah.
Frank. But now, if we go to functional terms, and something you've talked about, Frank, as well, is that how things stay, the balance between extroverted sensing and introverted feeling, where things stay longer with Lewis. With Frank, it's like he does have those FI moments, but it's like there's more of the artisan thing of he has the ability to move on. It depends what he wants to do in the moment. Mm-hmm. That it's almost like he's more of an artisan, more of an artisan than Lewis. But what I really mean, but in socionics terms and MBTI terms, what I mean by that is the Jungian temperament of Frank is EP. So they're a little bit more about the improvising. And I suppose the idea is that they're bigger peers than the ISFPs, is the idea, because the ISFP leads more with a judging function, and the ESFP leads more with a perceiving function. So they're less judgy overall than the ISFP. I don't know what you think about that.
So what would be the equivalent for Lewis? Is it IP or is it something else?
In socionics, Lewis would be internally, not in terms of external behavior, but internally an introverted judger, because the first function is a judging function, and so it's like very much like judging things based on his like personal ethics and beliefs and conscience and things like that.
Okay, but you said that Frank's temperament would be EP, so I'm just trying to think what would be the equivalent for Lewis?
The equivalent for Lewis is IJ. But in MBTI it would be IP.
Okay.
Right.
So I don't know about that, but I would just say that I think that IP is enjoy urinating more frequently than EJs do.
Oh, right. That's why he asked me. Very good, Jeff. Very good. Oh,
I was trying desperately to get to that joke, and you were taking too long to.
Yeah, but okay. Let's put. We can move away from functions, and we can now talk more in human speak. So yeah, I mean, so we've talked about like the sociological differences of Lewis is more basically is more part of the community, is closer to these people, and Frank is further away from these people. So we've sort of like made that point. Frank also is I think you've talked about it's like it's more. I suppose the way I get it from what I've seen and what you've said, Frank is a little bit more in the moment than Meldrick. That he can get over things quicker. That and what he said for him, the job is the performance in the box. But then there's also the sort of the non-type factor of the fact that Frank goes back and forth between being cynical and being concerned about morality and stuff, and that's played out with his also where it comes up with his mixed view of religion.
Yeah, I was going to say Frank was also raised Catholic, so that affects like his perceptions on things as well.
Mm.
And the thing when you were comparing as far as getting over stuff, it's funny that in this episode, Lewis mentions how he gets over things much faster than his wife does. You see a contrast with like he's still an artisan and his wife is not, and so that's a contrast as well.
But like I said, we and this is good that this episode came after the last one, because the last one concentrating on Meldrick's response to the death of Cressetti.
Yeah, and how that was with Kellerman as well.
I mean, so Frank never had a partner before. He was always a lone agent.
Well, the TV show doesn't really get into that, like, how long that was the case, or it never says that Bayless was actually his first partner to work without a partner. Like I said, the background I gave in real life is he did in fact have a partner, but it was a federal agent that he was working with on a special task force as opposed to in the homicide unit. So in reality, when he first came in the unit for a certain period of time, he didn't have a partner from the. I don't know when he first got one or who it even was, but David Simon was only with the homicide unit for a year, and for most of that time, Edgerton had been working with the task force. So it was only to the tail end of the time Simon was there that he was working on like regular homicide cases.
Right, and I'm also thinking
he was partnered up with the guy. Now I'm going blank on his name, but the guy that Felton was based on. Those scenes were very true to the book, and that he was objected, and so it wasn't necessarily even that Edgerton didn't want to work with anybody, but he and the real life Felton, whatever his real name was, so that was part of the problem.
And I'm also thinking that it might not be the case that Lewis has more feeling than Frank. It's just that he has more empathy than Frank because, like I said, he's closer to these people and more easily able to connect with them. Does that make? Do you agree with that?
Maybe in some ways. I think in other ways, not so much. I think it just depends. I think Frank's able to connect really well with some people. But and even when he doesn't necessarily, like even if he doesn't necessarily relate to them, really, he's good at faking it. When the first scene I ever showed you from Homicide, from Black and Blue, where he's talking to the guy that just shooting the other dude, even though he didn't. In that one, he was definitely using some like fake empathy.
Yeah.
To try to convince the dude that he's like, I'm like you, and I'm part of the black community, so I'm trying to stand up for us. He very much was trying to like bond with the dude, but he wasn't really sincere in terms of he was just trying to get him to confess.
Yeah, and we mentioned this before that, like I said, when we mentioned the, so that's what we're going to call them. They're like the Nation of Islam-esque people that Meldrick Lewis was sympathetic towards in the past because of the things they did for the community. And there was a bit of a discussion there. Okay, so I've said what I've said about. What are your thoughts on the introversion extroversion thing for Frank and Lewis?
I thought you'd give me a better opening than that.
Okay. Okay. Okay, I'll give you a better opening than that. You yourself have, like some of your earlier videos, you were identifying as ISFP, and then eventually you identified as ESFP. Do you see some of the same issues in these characters about, I identify with this character in this way or in that way? Like, which one?
I think what I've tried to tell people is the important thing to remember about introversion and extroversion is it's not really about who's more outgoing.
Yep.
Now, if you were to guess based on that, you might be right a majority of the time just by guessing or extrapolating, as Frank would say. But you also might be wrong quite a bit of the time because you're looking at it only in certain context. What is true about extroverts, we do seek out people or social interactions of some kind, social feedback, so relationships with people are important to us in some way. It's more about I like one thing that defined it. It's like where you get your energy from, and being around people or interaction with people is energizing to extroverts. But that doesn't necessarily mean that love social situations or parties or anything like that. That tends to get used by a lot of things like tests or whatever, trying to determine people's type. They ask these questions about early from parties, are you the last one to leave? Well, that's entirely situational based on whether someone is actually enjoying a party or social gathering, whether it's something they're into, things like that. There's a lot of other factors to that. So you can't really judge based on, you're thinking about two people from work and you say, well, go out all the time and Bob says he'd rather go home. Steve must be an extrovert and Bob an introvert. Well, that's not really, from a typological standpoint anyway, that's not really the case. There's why they're going out and what they're actually doing, because it could be that Steve is somebody that, say, is an ISFJ maybe and feels like he has an obligation to go to certain social functions, with a spouse or with family or other things like that. And he may not actually be enjoying himself that much at all. He may just feel like he needs to go to those things because it's his duty for some reason.
So,
and Bob, meanwhile, could be like, and not feel like that any of the social invitations he was getting were things he was into doing, or he didn't like people. He didn't really have anybody he felt like he could actually have fun with. He felt he could even be the opposite of, he doesn't want to go out, and he goes out with the group of people available to him that he's has to be restrained in some way. He can't be himself. He's around people that don't have the same interests, or behavior in that setting bothers them in some way. There's all these other factors that can be considered. And to get it back to homicide, I would say that Tim, that he doesn't really have any close friends, which tends to actually be the case. People think, again, when they're kind of about it, they think, extroverts have lots of friends, introverts not as many. But the reality is, extroverts may have more acquaintances.
Yeah.
But they often don't have at all close friends, because their way that they interact with people doesn't tend to lend itself for, devoting to a certain person or a small group of people, whereas with introverts it tends to be, because social interaction is the opposite of energizing, is more draining for introverts, end up with a small group of people that they really have a bond with, because they would rather have one-on-one interaction, and they'd rather that time, they use, I don't know what the exact terms for this is, but their social time is more valuable to them, and they're going to sort of actually use it more wisely than extroverts are, because they're not as much about energizing from all these people. They're more about the connection they have with those people. So they'll end up being closer to the people that they are friends with. See that in Homicide, in that Lewis probably is closer to people he knows well, because he sort of allows himself for that to happen, and sort of an interest in sort of bonding that way. At least that's the way it comes out anyway.
Yeah, he seems to be a bit more empathetic.
Plus, there's a stubbornness there that I think all SPs have, but I think scale of that, and that ISFPs are probably actually less stubborn than some of the other SPs in terms of their flexibility. They're kind of more, Kersey referred to them as accommodators. They're more accommodating than the other ones in terms of they're willing to. Important to them. You saw Lewis in the episode where he talked about, with his wife, he had compromised on a whole bunch of other things, and he wanted to keep the painting because that was like the one thing he wanted to say, this stays. Situation, Pendleton would have been insistent upon more things than Lewis was. He would have had more things where he was more he would be more emphatic about his own sort of individuality, saying, this is me, take it or leave it kind of attitude, as opposed to as compromising as Lewis was.
With Pendleton, I sort of see his SP nature. It's like more through him. It's like more. I think it's more prevalent. Whereas with Lewis, I see it more with his interactions with women, the thing about his driving. There's fewer moments for me in that, but I'm not sure about what I'm saying in that area. But when you're there, talks about introversion, extroversion, and again, people having things in common. Say you got ENTP. ENTP is it's. I think for the ENTP, they're going to communicate with people if they have something in common with them in terms of an interest. Now, the benefit of that is, as they get older, they're interested in more things. So there's more things they can connect to people with, and so they can either connect with them in terms of an object, or they can argue with them. Whereas, so in terms of sociability, even though they're an extrovert, an ENTJ might be more towards socializing with someone on a business level, or social climbing for a business reason rather than just for an ESTJ reason. Whereas some of the SFs, some of the introverted SFs, might be better with people than the extroverts. And I put it as, there's 4 kinds of extroversion and 4 kinds of introversion. That sort of lines up with the functions, where the SE DOMs, it's more about doing stuff, and of course temperament affects us as well. The FE DOMs really are more towards other people, and then maybe the FI DOMs are as well, but maybe more one-to-one connections with the FI DOMs. TI DOMs can be a little bit weird. TE DOMs, more extroverted, they're more towards practical things. NE DOMs, they can get people enthusiastic, try to win people over with their personalities, or to other people that can appear weird. Like Jeff yourself, you personally like ENFPs. Oh yes, somebody asked me today, do you think there's an ENFP character in Homicide?
ENFP?
Or like a guest character ever been like an ENFP?
So far up to this point in Homicide, I would say the only one that I would say is probably an ENFP was the newspaper guy that got killed that was friends with G.
Right. It does seem...
I would say he's probably an ENFP.
It does seem that quite a few ENFPs are journalists.
Yeah.
Probably the curiosity. The curiosity.
I think that often that ENFPs have a sort of a desire or a dream that they can change the world in some way.
Yeah.
And so a lot of times they tend to be the type of journalist who would, like that guy was, who in doing so, he's not just trying to report news, he's actually trying to change with his writing.
I think an acquaintance of mine, one of their parents was one of their parents is an ENFP and probably was a journalist. Right.
Brody could be, but I would say maybe seems more likely to be an INFP than an ENFP. But
yes, he's not quite. He's not got the energy of. Even Donald Trump wouldn't call an ENFP low energy.
No, they don't tend to be that.
No, they have the most energy of all the types to ENFPs. It's like they're the only type. They're the only type I'm with where I'm like, whoa, because not only do they have a lot of energy, they change subjects a lot, so it's hard for me to concentrate on them.
Yeah.
So I can't change subjects either because I'm concentrated on following them. It stops me from being distracted. So yeah, we did the SE DOMs, we've done the NE DOMs, SI DOMs. They're probably more procedural, more book-like, more like. I mean, like you said, Jeff, that you like you're sort of like you're an ESFP, but you're in the sort of like enacting a you've got like an introverted SJ kind of job that you're sort of stuck in. And
have fun on my job because the job itself is not interesting, really, in any way.
So it's like concrete, procedural, bureaucratic stuff. Whereas that's that kind of introversion. Whereas the NI DOMs, it's like they're in their own world of feelings, and like hard to understand, moody people, or if they're in their own world of like systems.
It's one of the areas that I think the functions really don't. They're a supplement, but they don't really tell the whole picture because there's such a big difference to me between INTJs and INFJs. Like in terms of how they behave, they might internally be, they can come across very, very differently. Because one thing I've noticed is, and it goes back to what we said about the social interaction not being able to necessarily indicate introversion or extroversion, because they seem much more talkative, and if anything, they sometimes give too much information. Stream of stuff that they try to get out, explain something to somebody. Whereas INTJs seem almost the opposite, that they use as few words as possible, that they very much are about cutting to the point and saying, what exactly is the issue, as opposed to using a whole bunch of extraneous words, unless they're just trying to show off.
Yeah.
Their vocabulary, which could be the case if somebody was really trying to do that. But for the most part, they're much more and being cutting than they are about giving a whole bunch of information.
Well, that's right.
One thing that they both have in common, but INFJs, it seems like they more vocally present these.
Yeah,
and come across as somewhat indecisive because of it, whereas INTJs tend to come across as more emphatic of this is the proper way to go here. Even if they considered a lot of possibilities in their head, they don't tend to vocalize them as much.
Yeah. the way Victor's school of socionics sees it is that in terms of functions, INTJ, they're not going to show as much emotion. And when they do tend to show emotion, they tend to show negative emotion, like as you sort of like implied there in that example. And the INTJs are crap at showing positive emotionality and like trying to get people going. Where like basically they're crap at trying to be an ESFJ. Like if you tried like trying to enact their role, and even in Kersey temperament theory, they're like at opposite ends of the scale. ESFJ and INTJ.
Yeah.
And so they're really weak at FE. The saving grace of INTJ, though, and you can see this in Haley, is that INTJs can be good with FI. And so the people they're close to, they can almost be like an INFP and be like, have a conscience and all that kind of stuff. Have good values. But then there can also be those that are less developed and cynical, and maybe they've grown cynical because people can't get close enough to them to get to know them, because they do have this harsh exterior of being pedantic and sarcastic and having a superiority complex. So it's hard for people to get to know them, to sort of like get past that harsh exterior. INFJs, the functions would say that they're crap at TE, they're crap at getting stuff done. The INTJs, they can lack energy, but the moderate amount of energy the INTJ has, they spend it very wisely. INFJ, the idea is they're crap at TE, they're crap at getting stuff done. And they're in their heads more. They are good with people, but you have that weird contradiction in INFJs where they can be like, it's almost as if like NI is the most introverted of all the functions in terms of like the most inside your own head and away and like unconscious, versus FE, which is like the most connected with other people. So that there's a weird, it's almost like they're two different people. Weird polarity there between those two aspects. And then, of course, as you said, NF versus NT values.
Yeah.
Between the two. So, differences between INFJ and INTJ. And Jeff's parents are those two types.
That's true.
Anything else to add?
About that, no.
Right. Anything to add that doesn't have to do anything to do with functions?
Well, as far as this episode is concerned, like we've said, the plot itself is not wholly interesting, and about who was the thief. I don't know. Like I said, I don't remember when I saw this the first time how obvious it was who the culprit was. But obviously, knowing that it seems to come across very obvious, so that part's not really a mystery. So then it's a matter of, is the interesting, the character, sort of what he has to do and his interactions with Cox. And, it's realistic, it's believable, but it's just not that interesting. So that's the thing. I agree with that aspect of what Morris said about the interesting stuff comes in the characterization with the relationship of Frank and Lewis, and also, Frank and his wife, and they're having issues. And obviously that heavily, because Mary doesn't really say what her issue is.
Yes, I would have liked a bit more on that.
Yeah, and I can say without spoiling too much that there will be more of that in the future. But in this episode, you can't really judge that part of it because it hasn't really come out. I mean, all she basically tells Tim is she basically implies a cop's wife, because he's not spending enough time at home, and it actually could be that in some ways temporarily improved their home life because he spent more time at home, and now that he's back at work full time, she feels some emptiness of him not being there for the time that he was, and especially now that they have a child, that he's not spending enough time with his daughter, that he doesn't know these little moments that are happening, and she has to tell him what's happening, and there's sort of like a disconnect there. In this episode, he tries to sort of get back into her graces with that, because he tries to start interacting with his daughter a little more, towards the end of the episode. So the way she looks and talks, that she thinks that someone else. So,
and then there's something that's referred to that, like there's the impression given that Frank's spending quite a bit of time in the bar and he should get home. And by the time he gets home, maybe his daughter's already asleep. Although a lot of children are asleep by 8 o'clock anyway at that age. So,
they don't exactly sleep on the regular hours for the most part. So
right.
It's kind of a matter of just being available when they need you, kind of thing.
But I mean, I did think that, I mean, about 60 or 70 years ago, they would have said something like, "Oh, come off it. That's not grounds for divorce."
Well, yeah, and she didn't even say she wants a divorce. She's just sort of floating these ideas of how she's feeling out there. So, and the kind of awkwardness where Bayless, if Bayless had come out and said, do want to be your partner again, Frank might have actually agreed with that, because it would have been a straightforward thing, and he would have, or he might have initially said no, but then later on said, okay, well, maybe, I should take you up on that. But because of the way Bayless sort of hems and haws himself, because he's sort of unsure about it, it's easy for Frank to sort of dismiss it. Better for the job that we don't work together. So that I relate to also, because when people approach me in that kind of wishy-washy way, instinct is to dismiss it also. It's just come out and say what you want to say, and I can agree or disagree with it. And if you just kind of meander around the bush, then whatever is my general reaction to stuff like that.
So why do you think Bayless doesn't want to be Frank's partner? Do you think he just feels he was too open with him about the child abuse thing?
That could be part of it. I don't remember actually if they really delve much into that in future episodes, so I can say at this point, just speculating based on what we've had so far, that maybe that Tim feels like Frank can't understand me, because when by his reaction to the way I am with the murder of children, that he doesn't relate, he doesn't understand. So it's like, I feel like be able to get past this in terms of our relationship, even though obviously for plenty of cases that they worked on that didn't involve kids, they've been able to. But he also, said that Frank was different in terms of after the stroke, they didn't work together as well. But I don't know how much of that is he's just sort of clinging to something. There's something that he just, like, he feels like he needs a change, and he's using that as an excuse. But I don't know.
Does the network bring in an attractive partner for Bayless?
Well, we'll have to let you stay in the dark on that one. But
I can always imagine.
Does have a woman you might find attractive. I don't know.
Ooh.
She's the title character of the next one, because it's called Woo's on First, and she is Woo. So,
right.
What do you think about her? But what score would you give this one out of 10?
Well, you see, it was affected by the fact that I was getting some edging done during this episode. And what I mean by edging is putting bits of sellotape on the edge of this book to protect it a bit. This old book, an illustrated guide to World War II tanks, and so that always makes it more pleasant, because it's like through the boring bits. And again, I was thinking about the character aspect of Lewis and Frank, and I wasn't really thinking about the plot, because to be honest, I don't watch Homicide for the plots.
Well,
so
I mean,
the difference between a good plot,
based on the plot, either it can be whatever it is you enjoy about the episode, whether it's plot related or not. So
I mean, it's like, so whether the plot's crap or good, it doesn't really affect my. It doesn't really affect it for me. It's in terms of like. I mean, it would have been in the past where the cleverness of the plot would have affected me on an intellectual level. These days, it's like, does the plot put the characters in interesting situations where we reveal something about their character, like in the previous episode? And it wasn't perfect, but I'm concentrating more, and because we're looking at it through typology, and the strength of the series is in the characters, and in this season some of the dialogue as well, then I'm more focused on that. So those things will determine how highly. So I suppose I'll give it about a 7.
Okay. I would also give it a 7 because, I still think it's a good episode of television. It held my interest. We talked about the character moments that are good in it. And, the only episode I've rated lower than that so far was the one from the 3rd season that was about the wife-beating guy. And there wasn't anything in this episode that going, like, cringing at or thinking, oh, this is not good television. So
that would have made me depressed.
From, lowering it to a 6, but I would say that it's right on the borderline, but I'd give it a 7 also. So join us next time for Woo's on First.
Right, and then I'll probably listen to this again. So I've got to stop it and find the actual hangout to stop it. Right, and
on First, Woo's on First.
Yes. So if people want to find that, Abbott and Costello. Right.